parse these out as you learn about disparities and inequities, understanding that the minority status itself doesn't cause the disparity or inequity. Let's go to the next slide. Another important term that is a little abstract that I wanted to introduce in this lecture too is belonging. And while belonging is a very ordinary need, it's so ordinary maybe that we don't think about all the parts of it and what it means. And it's a need shared by people with and without disabilities. It's a universal need. And it's the need to feel deeply connected to others in meaningful ways. And the next slide has a chart that kind of tells you all the parts of belonging. And so that's what I mean by, it's so ordinary that we don't think about all of these different parts. So I wondered if, as you look at this chart, what do you think are among the most difficult kind of, if we were to like rank them in terms of difficulty to achieve, what do you think are the most difficult for people with disabilities to feel or to find in their communities?
Somebody said supported
and accepted.
Needed.
Befriended.
Invited.
I think no.
No.
Important.
So welcomed is, it seems like a step further from being invited, right? First step is we're invited, second step maybe is we're welcome. I think supported is interesting too, because it takes some knowing what types of support a person needs to match that. Befriended is one I know that many people in the parent community, parents of kids with disabilities, have talked about how you can put kids together in certain social situations. It can be really difficult, especially as kids get older, to kind of create that chemistry of an authentic friendship. Because you have kids who are, you want to, ideally most friendships are mutually beneficial, right? In terms of going back and forth and sharing things and experiencing things. And so some parents have shared that it can be difficult to know how to create or promote that, support that. It takes a lot of effort and time to truly know someone. Yeah, and you can think about your own experience so far in our LEND cohort too. I mean, we're still, I'd say, on the spectrum of just beginning. And so, while I hope that you're making your way towards feeling, belonging in this experience, we're still getting to know each other. And we're still kind of testing out those waters. And so you can think about that from this own little mini experience in your life and how disability intersecting with that changes it as well. All right, let's go to the next. So, how many people have heard of the term intersectionality? Most, or maybe half. Okay. So this term is coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, which, if you've heard in the media in the last several months, critical race theory is also developed by Dr. Crenshaw. And I hope you haven't based what you think critical race theory is primarily on the media, because it's largely been misunderstood. So that's a side note. Intersectionality is a cornerstone of not only that theory, but many other theories that look at that a person's experience of living with multiple oppressed identities is unique in that so it's not just to study like those oppressed identities separately, like being a woman, being a person of color, and having a disability. It's also the intersection of those that makes a difference. So it's the overlapping that causes multiple marginalization, and that's something that we've missed in a lot of our years of research, because we've looked at things more separated than we have as a interlocking intersectional experience. Let's go to the next one. So this is a little cartoon that says that, or a little graphic that says intersectionality is the belief that oppressions are interlinked and cannot be solved alone. So they're not isolated. Intersectionality. And this is another quote about if we're gonna take what we're learning about intersectionality and turn it into action, it's really about fighting discrimination within discrimination. So tackling inequities within inequities and protecting minorities within minorities. So recognizing like the further marginalization that people of color with disabilities experience. And this is a critical piece that I wanted to bring up before we moved into the disability rights and models discussion, because largely what we're going to learn is through the whitewashed, disability rights perspective. Like much of history, what's been focused on and captured, unfortunately, is often left out, contributing members of the history that were people of color. So you see that a little bit in Crip Camp and in some of the drunk history, the Two to Humans, the 504 sit-in, the role of the Black Panthers, for example, was a major one in actually making that sit-in possible for as long as it was, which pushed the policymakers to do something. And you don't hear about the intersecting of those civil rights movements very often. So let's go to the next one. So disability justice, I also wanted you to know, is not just kind of like another way of saying disability rights. It's actually its own theory and approach, and it's grounded in 10 tenets or principles. But I summarize they're all major, but I summarize them here rather than go into each of the 10. One of the important pieces being that disability justice recognizes that disabled people of the global majority, which are Black and brown people, share common ground in confronting ableism and racism. So with a disability justice approach, you really want to amplify and center those experiences and voices, not as an afterthought, which many in the disability justice movement feel that considering the needs specifically of Black and brown people with disabilities has been like well, after we do this, then we're going to think about what it's like for Black people with disabilities to get housing or, find transportation in their area or whatever. So it's instead of an afterthought, it's at the center and forefront. Also, disability justice in counter to medical model approaches, which we're going to talk about, believes that all bodies have power and strengths, and a big emphasis is on it. That power and strength is not despite disability, but because of it. So really embracing the idea that disability isn't just something to overcome at best, but it's something that can bring rich perspective and its own power and strength. So I don't think we can click that from, can we? Not find out. No. Okay, we'll work with that. But this is so I'll give you the brief synopsis. This is a young advocate who is sharing about their fear of the criminal justice system, both as a person of color and as a person with a disability. And as you may have seen, in some news stories, but often it's not kind of connected by the media, that many instances of people who've been murdered by law enforcement also were people with disabilities. And many of those cases also involve communication differences, directly tied to a disability. And so this person is talking about how all of this intersects for them in terms of their identity, their sexual orientation identity, their gender identity, their disability identity, and specifically the concern with criminal justice and our need to transform those systems.
Do you want me to try to pull it up on YouTube and share it?
I think we're okay right now. Maybe in the break or whatever. But yeah, I don't want to have any more downtime. So that is the first chunk. And I wanted to take a pause and see what your thoughts or questions were with the first chunk before we go into the models next. We kind of have 3 chunks. So that chunk, which hopefully introduced some new or reviewed some vocabulary for you. Second chunk will be our disability models, and then we'll talk about institutionalization. Were you familiar with those terms already from other classes? Some people mixed. Sometimes it helps to know like where they're positioned in our work, so hopefully. I do think it's interesting that, you know, what we just talked about is more of like an academic and institutional focus on this type of work. So I think about how interesting it is, how differently and how similarly some parts of that would be shared if I were meeting with like stakeholders, you know, from the disability community. So how would we think about different terms? You know, health equity, definitely, and ableism would come to play, but just, I think it always helps to realize when we're studying from an academic perspective, rather than how would it look different if we were learning this together, you know, in a more community-based setting. All right, let's jump into the models. All right, so as I mentioned, I like Rebecca Tossig, actually, from the Sitting Pretty book, also has a glasses kind of metaphor of let's look at these from that perspective of different lenses rather than like these are bad, these are good. Also, you're going to notice that while there's some of a timeline kind of thing happening here, there's not like this happened from 1900 to 1950 and then we stopped and we thought, like there's definitely overlap. So there's actually no models that are over. They're all kind of, and more so I want you to think about as you're out and about in life and you're seeing messages about disability, thinking about which model might be most represented by that message. So I think they'll come to mind as we study them too. So keeping in mind that these are human-made, these are ways that people have come up with to kind of collect the ways that we think about disability with the hope to guide society in our treatment of people with disabilities and kind of help us understand, here's why you might be thinking about disability in this way. And here's why we want to either shift differently or why we want to keep going down this path that you're thinking. Also, it's helpful because it helps us consider context and history. So if we're thinking about the way a person was treated with a disability or the way we talked about disability 50 years ago, that is a relevant point that it was 50 years ago. So we do need to consider history and context. So let's look at the first one, which is the moral model of disability. This is usually cited as the oldest model. So it also provided the basis for justification for segregation. Many people kind of lump contagion concerns under this, the idea that, which hopefully is mostly outdated, but the idea that if you're around a person with a disability, you may.
It was good. It was about CEUs.
Okay. You may catch their disability. So we hopefully have realized that that's that, you know, most disabilities are not in fact contagious, and that, but the moral model of disability kind of encompasses that. It's the idea that disability may be associated with sin and shame. So sometimes the idea is that sin or bad luck caused the disability. So I know in our family, we have two examples of this in that my mom's grandmother, my mom's side of the family is from Eastern Kentucky. So Appalachian views on disability are really interesting to me for that reason. But my mom's grandmother believed that I was born with my disability because my mom must have seen a snake. So snakes in her culture and connected to her church were representative of Satan or the devil. So there was a connection to like sin and seeing a snake and then me being here. So you can imagine that was kind of interesting for my mom to navigate that as she also was learning about my life and what that was going to be like. And the other example was my son growing up in China in an orphanage was actually not allowed to attend. The orphanage had a small school, but he was not allowed to attend the small school because of his specific disability, dwarfism. They felt like brought bad luck to the other kids. So, and the other kids with disabilities range from kids with Down syndrome to kids with albinism, kids who are blind. So for whatever reason, their Chinese culture at that, you know, orphanage at least believed that different types of disabilities had different connections to bad luck or kind of, and so they had a different approach to segregation which was, which was interesting. I think I just accidentally rolled over. And that might have been. So there are a few rare exceptions where disability is worshipped. And that would actually also fall under the moral model because it would be, on the other end of the spectrum. But more often than not, that is not the case. And then this graphic that you see is actually from a Cincinnati paper many years ago, thankfully, but you can see that it says at the top, feeble-minded is the hub to our wheel of vice, crime, and pauperism. And it's got a caricature of a person who appears to have some facial dysmorphia or some type of disability. And then they're linking that person's image to all sorts of, trouble, juvenile crime to other things I can't read, but that I remember were like seem to be the downfall of society. So this is an example of moral model of disability. Then next we have what might be the most popular model. I don't know. It's in contention with medical model. So the charity model of disability is really hard to overcome because it's very successful in raising money. And there's actually been some fascinating research studies that have taken transcripts of different ways that organizations have talked about their mission about kids with disabilities and found which were more successful in raising money. And unfortunately, at least for my work, a charitable model of disability sells. And so it's very hard to convince people not to use that when it brings in money. The downside of a charitable model is it depicts people with disabilities as victims of their circumstances and deserving of pity. And so pity has a number of, negative consequences from it, but you can imagine that if you pity someone, you may give them money or donate to their cause, but you don't necessarily want to work with them, or you don't want to be their supervisee, or, you can think about the power dynamics that are caused by a charitable model of disability. And we see this in a lot of images. This is an image of a girl kind of walking into the light away from her crutches. You may have seen there's a tombstone that at least internet lore has, that a father designed for his son who had passed away, that has like the son like flying out of the wheelchair, reaching towards the sky. So kind of this idea of like leaving your burdens and behind as defined by society, and a charitable reaction or outcome. So this is another model. And then the next one is the medical model of disability, which, like I said, this charitable model and medical model might be in contention with each other as the most commonly used lenses to see disability, but medical model would definitely win in healthcare world. So in medical model disability thinking, we see disability as a list of problems or symptoms, and we see disability as within the individual. So we think that if the symptoms could be resolved, then that individual would be cured. And there's often an assumption that cure is the obvious answer, or cure is the obvious goal for everyone. There's not a lot of thought to what would society look like without this aspect of diversity. And so a lot of our training is based on this medicalization of disability as well, which is really at the heart of some of the mission of LEND. We want you to leave not only with an understanding of what symptoms are so that you could diagnose a disability, but also what is life like with that disability outside of the walls of a hospital. But we've got a lot of work to do because the way that we train kind of reinforces this way of thinking. So you can see this is a really common approach to images in medical textbooks, where we have a black and white image of a child with usually little to no clothes on, and we put this black box over their face. The idea behind the black box is to give some anonymity or privacy, but the psychological impact of the black box is we are not able to see that child's eyes. And so it subconsciously kind of dehumanizes that child or that person in our minds. These are things we're not thinking of when we look at these images. And what this image is supposed to teach us is that, so this child actually has the same disability that I do, osteogenesis imperfecta. And so we can see that They have a kind of triangular shaped head is one of our symptoms, and you can see bowing in the limbs and a barrel chest. So this is what this image is supposed to teach, but there are other ways that we can teach this with just slightly different images that could really still help us make that human connection. And this is a child, and that, they are a person, basically. So it can be very accidentally dehumanizing. And while this image, I don't know how old this one is, but I mean, these practices still happen. I here had to stop. We were at a clinic shortly after adopting my son, and a provider asked him to stand up against the wall, and he got out like a old, like, I say old school camera, but it wasn't his phone. It was like a camera, a real camera. And didn't wait for my son to smile or anything, but just started like taking pictures of his body. And so I stopped the interaction and I said, like, what are these? Can you tell both of us, like, what are these for? And let's like involve him in this situation rather than photographing him like he's like at a zoo or something. And I think it's something that providers can just get in their routine. And this particular person, I guess, used it for his records of capturing something, I don't know, but I felt like that it was important to involve the patient, let them know what those pictures were used for. And in terms of working with a child, I mean, my kids love having their picture taken. So take a moment to ask them to smile rather than like taking a picture of them without. So still happens. Let's look. Yeah. So excited.
We can go back to the previous slide.
Yeah.
I was just curious why the word cured is in quotes.
So I think it's the idea that if we just remove, I mean, I wrote this, so I should know what it is, but I think it's the idea that the almighty cure, so the word cure is also super powerful. If we use that with marketing, if we're an advocacy organization, it immediately draws in more money, more attention. And so there's this idea that what cure means to you might not be what cure means to me. So when I think of a cure for my disability, I think realistically that when people talk about a cure for my disability, they're not talking about curing me. They're talking at this point about genetically engineering that people like me won't be born anymore. So the world sees that as a cure for OI. I don't see that as a cure for OI. Like, not only what would that do for me, but also I think a lot of us in the disability community find it kind of like unrealistic. So if you were to cure, so let's say if you were to find a drug that could stop my fractures, well, that would be great. And I might check that out. But like, you're not actually going to cure me. I'm not going to sprout to whatever average height is and suddenly have a typical body so what cure means to different people varies. And I think sometimes we don't think to that next step of like, well, are we really curing current people with disabilities, or are we just talking about not having any more because of genetic involvement? Does that help a little bit?
As a parent, I think having a cure to some of the symptoms, my son is autistic, and having a cure to some of the symptoms or comorbidities is something I would want because it will improve his quality of life. Sure. So cure sometimes is taken in a very wrong context in the disability world, but it doesn't always have to be that way. It can be in a very positive case, coming from a very positive place. So,
do you mean a cure like the elimination of all characteristics, or do you mean like the reduction of certain symptoms?
no, reduction of symptoms. A lot of autistic people have a lot of seizures.
Yeah.
If that's cure, it just like drastically improves not just the quality of their life, but their loved ones too, their caregivers too.
Yeah.
My son can't speak. If there's a cure for him to be able to communicate, talk, or have any kind of verbalization, I think that's a huge improvement in his quality of life. And I think he would love to have that as much as anyone else.
Yeah.
So cure is not, I don't think cure should always be treated as a bad thing.
Mhm.
When we're talking about cure, it's the context in which it is being talked.
Yeah. And I don't think this personally or professionally don't think that cure should be either. I see it actually the opposite. I see is that it's always assumed to be a good thing. I see organizations putting on their banner, we're fighting for the cure, and everybody agreeing that that's, first of all, everybody thinking that they're on the same page with what that means. And then second of all, everybody thinking that that would be 100%, positive. So I think we need to see like the gray in between and recognize. And people that are working more from the models that we're going to talk about next are definitely not opposed to medical advancements and like finding new ways to help people communicate that can't communicate. A lot of what you're describing is what we would call patient-centered outcomes. So actually asking the patients what is important to them. And so communication often comes up as top of the list, mobility comes up as top of the list, but type of mobility doesn't come up to patients as much as it does to non-patients. So non-patients often will prioritize walking as the preferred type of mobility, whereas some patient groups, depending on the disability, will say, I'm not so much concerned about walking, I just want to be able to get from point A to point B, whether that be, with a walker or a wheelchair or whatever it is. So mobility is more important than type of mobility. So definitely advancements are not in opposition to a social model or a cultural model of disability. So advancements don't even fit, only in the medical model of disability. It's just the idea of, are we looking beyond only that person's symptoms? And are we recognizing that sometimes our society is disabling instead of the individual's conditions? Let's go to the next one. So this one is the social model of disability is exactly what I just described. So recognizing that society can be the disabling factor. The idea that at some point, I'm going to reference the Sitting Pretty book again, for those of you that read that, you've already read this, but at some point we decided, as we were kind of advancing our architecture, that we were kind of tired of climbing from like cave to cave and level to level. And we decided, let's try this rope ladder, let's try a rope. And then we decided that, these stairs are a pretty good idea to get us from level to level in buildings. And most bodies could do stairs. And we realized that, that was good enough at the time. But as we've had advancements like ramps and curb cuts and elevators, now we're also making conscious decisions of which bodies we want in and out of certain environments. And the same is true for minds. We know that there are certain ways that we can better include people who are neurodivergent. And so now that we as a society, I know our we is maybe different, but we have a lot of that knowledge now. And so overlooking it or not using it really is not at the fault of the individual with the disability, but at society's decision. We're leaving some barriers in place, and that's a societal choice that people or perspectives from the social model of disability would recognize that this is a society issue that we need to address as a group, not just target the individual and think that that person is going to be fine if we just work on them.
I think she was at a therapy session.
Oh, okay. Is that code for something? I don't know. Okay, I think we got one more model. All right, so so important point that I'm going to kind of throw one more model at you, but there are actually more models that people have come up with. These are the ones that I see most commonly cited, but I didn't want you to think that I was like giving you the all-inclusive comprehensive list. So this one is the cultural or minority model, meaning that disability is influenced by our identities and our context. So this one is more considering that disability is more like other marginalized groups than it is like a medical diagnosis or symptoms. So it's kind of connecting those dots. And then I've listed in the smaller print there some of the other models that I didn't talk about as in detail: functional, biopsychosocial, and socio-political. The major ones. So this one, I think this was an idea that I wanted to bring in related to how quality of life relates to this, and how with family advocacy, we may need to switch back and forth. So there may be times, at least in reflecting on our experience with my son, there have definitely been times that I've focused more on a medical model approach to his healing. So we've been looking at his, assessment results and what treatment we can use. And then there are also times that I switch my lens to more of a social model approach. For example, when I'm working with the school to talk about different ways that they can support him in his learning, and, is the class size too big for him to be able to focus? And so those things are outside of him, and more in like the societal model. So what I like about this slide is it kind of gives the up and down ride, but I hope that it also switches you out of the idea that like one model is better. The medical model approach, because it has been so dominant, especially in our healthcare, has been difficult for us to overcome the more negative parts of that model. But it's not to say that it's a bad model, or that we, if we want to abandon all attempts to treat symptoms and only embrace a social model. I mean, critics of the social model of disability have also said that, well, if I waved my magic wand and tomorrow society was just like rolling out the disability pride parade, for me, and everything was great, I would still have my chronic pain. So the social model of disability really wouldn't eliminate that for me. So it's really the idea of, I like that the bottom here focuses on quality of life, which is a way to kind of merge those together, and recognizing that the lenses overlap sometimes. You're not going to have like one starts here and then stops, and then the next, they flow into each other. And this slide just gives you more of a visual sense of a few of these. So you got one on your own. I think this brings us to, is this the end of the model section? Yeah, so I was going to try a Kahoot quiz. I don't know if that'll work with our technology issues today, but first I wanted to pause and ask, what examples of these models have you seen? Or what kind of instances or situations stand out to you that now we've talked through these models, you recognizing like, oh, that connects to this model or that model?
We were the three moms back here. We're just talking at lunch today about the comment, how many times have you heard God doesn't give you what you can't handle?
Yeah.
And how that, when people say that, I believe they mean it from a good place in their heart, but from the parent perspective, it's like, it's a little frustrating, because that's
It's not helpful, and sometimes we can't handle it. Sometimes it's really hard to handle, right? So,
And really, when you think about it, like, is it that different than you saw a snake and God gave you a baby? Like, it's not the punitive, but it's still the idea that like you were chosen for this.
right.
So, which, you don't know if that's somebody's belief system. It might be yours, but it may not be. So to put that on somebody else is a lot.
I think when I'm here in Lynn, I think more about like intellectual or like physical disability when we talk about it. But in my day-to-day work, I work in psychiatry, and thinking through this, there's a lot of parents that want their kids like who are like, it's just a medical thing, but there's a lot of things outside of the hospital too that make it difficult for them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's different. It's not like curbs or ramps or things like that, but the way that society is set up, it definitely affects those people too.
Yeah. Great. And one of the things that I've learned from reading some of the research on identity as people with psychiatric disabilities, and claiming that identity is different. It may be invisible. It may disclose itself due to kind of abrupt changes of behavior, but maybe not. But some that's been written about that talks about how the challenge of the search for the cure often slows progress in acceptance, and not that acceptance needs to be accepting, worse health, whether it be mental health or physical health, than you can be in with intervention, but more of acceptance of if this is going to be a lifetime diagnosis, we know psychologically there are many benefits to finding acceptance. And so it's kind of an intervention that we're leaving on the table if we're not, helping people move towards that. Yeah, Frank.
I think out of all the models that stuck out to me throughout the presentation was the societal model for disabilities, because there have been times where I've had like a couple of customers at work that I told them that I had autism, and they told me, "Oh, that's interesting. You don't seem like you have autism." It just seems kind of strange to me that they would ask me that, because in the back of my mind, I'd be like, okay, why would I lie about my own disability for?
Yeah.
Like, if I'm giving you all this like openly, then wouldn't it make sense for you to be able to just like be able to learn more about how it works, not just immediately assume that autism is sort of how it's rumored to be?
Mhm.
But yeah, I feel like out of all the models, society definitely plays a big part in how people with disabilities are viewed.
Yeah, that's a great example, because that interaction totally had to do with their reaction to you versus anything that you were really bringing to the table. We actually talked about that this morning. We had a very early faculty meeting at 7:30, so it was a little early to be talking about such deep topics, but we were talking about what it's like to be on the receiving end of microaggressions, like, well, I don't see you as having a wheelchair, or I don't think you act like someone who has autism, and what's behind that, meaning, as you said, either you don't believe me, or you don't think of me like you usually think of people in that category, which I guess, it's always meant as a compliment, because the person's saying, I think of you differently, but in a better way. But I don't think that they think of what's behind that, which is that if you didn't know me, or we hadn't had this good interaction, then you would still lump me into this group that you just told me that you usually, don't think of too kindly. So it's a very weird place to be, and to know how to respond to that. So, yeah, thanks for sharing that. As you were taught things about disability, whether it be in class or books you read or conversations people had with you, did anybody ever connect the social model to you in a way, or was it mostly taught from a different perspective? Yeah.
That in our school psychology program, we focus a lot on the social model.
Mhm.
I think a lot of the examples align with what Greg was saying as well, about like educating parents or teachers, practitioners on how we are thinking about dismantling barriers for our assistance, and thinking about what we can do from a systems level perspective to support all students in an equitable way. So that's kind of what the last few years have been for my educational training. But I remember when I was doing my undergrad in psychology, it was more related to the medical model.
Mhm.
So that's kind of how the models that I was taught.
Yeah, the trajectory.
Kind of changed.
Yeah, that's good. At least you're learning more. What about when you see headlines about disability? So a headline I think I saw last week was this woman overcomes disability to become a nurse. What model do you think?
Medical, like she's
Yeah.
cured of her disabilities and now she can be a nurse.
Yeah. So if you flipped it to woman overcomes ableism to become nurse, that would be a social model of disability, or a cultural model, but probably a social model of disability. But you don't see that very often. I don't think I've ever seen a headline that would say that. So most of our immediate messages that were sent in that way, like through headlines or through stories, really want to focus on the overcoming of the disability itself to achieve XYZ, rather than, the stigma about that disability, which is a bit, but meaningfully important. And that also is ramped up in our society because, we're a very individualized society. So we want to believe that, overcoming ableism, for example, is in the, within the capacity of all of us. If we just pull up our bootstraps and, work hard, we could do it on our own. Rather than believing that we are intrinsically, tied together as a collective group, and that hopefully we can lift many people to overcome ableism, but it does take a group effort. It's not something, an individual prize or medal to be won by a person. All right, I'm a little afraid to try Kahoot, but I'm gonna.
You put the quiz link and the chat. Yeah.
Did we have any questions from the chat? No? Okay. Yeah, I give up on this computer. I don't understand. It's like impossible to log into anything. It's very, I've ever seen that. So I remember though on the Kahoot, one of the questions, it was a quiz question that, and I'll also share the link. If people want to go through it, it's just 5 questions on your own. But one I asked, are these the only models? And so I think I already emphasized no, they are not. And then I have a couple of like scenarios, just like the headline scenario I just gave you, to determine, just to see if you're kind of getting the differences. Yeah. I think it's okay. I think I actually accidentally already gave you most of the answers anyway. So, and not that it was intentional, not that I was intending for it to be like difficult, but I don't think it'll be as interesting because I think I already kind of spoiled it. So do you feel like you kind of have a handle on that models, or do you feel okay? Okay, good. All right, let's see. I think our last portion is the deinstitutionalization. Which kind of, as you're pulling that up, you still have that on the PDF, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All kinds of mysteries happening today. So I just started a book, as you know, my interest in books about disability, but it just came out on Tuesday, called The Lost Girls of Willowbrook. And it's following, one of the largest institutions, and really one that pulled back the curtain on this like awful history of institutionalization. So it's a fictional book, but it's about Willowbrook, and I'm only like a quarter of the way through, so I don't have a review yet, but it's interesting. So I wanted to talk specifically about this idea of deinstitutionalization and recognizing that there's different parts of deinstitutionalization. So you may have heard of the large movement to move people out of psychiatric institutions. So that's deinstitutionalization is often criticized as being, unplanned and resulting in huge increases of people who are without homes. And, I think is often criticized for that. What people talk less about is that people with intellectual developmental disabilities are still living in institutional settings, despite what we're going to talk about, which is, laws and policies that should, in essence, not mean that as many people are living in these settings as they are. Go to the next slide. So the definition of institutions is trickier than you might think, but the way that we're going to define them are residential facilities that segregate and confine people with disabilities. So as advocates have worked to deinstitutionalize our communities, they've had to get really specific as to what is the difference between a small census institution, like a group home, and a home? They don't call it that, but so what sorts of things make your home a home? And I'm going to get started, and then if you can think of a few ideas to add to it. So one of the rules that they said, for it not to be an institution, you have to be able to come and go as you want. If you want to come home at 2 a.m., you come home at 2 a.m. You don't have like you have to be in by 8 p.m. Another rule that they said that for it not to be an institution, you have to have free access to food. What food you want and when you want food. So it can't be that breakfast is at 8, lunch is at noon, and if you're not there, you don't get that food. You should be able to go to your kitchen or your fridge and get out a Twinkie if you want. Or whatever other healthy stuff. So what other things like that do you think make a home and not like a small institution?
Not sharing a restroom or not sharing a bathroom?
Okay, so a choice of private facility if you want. Yeah. Elizabeth?
Being able to set it up the way you want to.
Yes, so that's a big one with CMS, Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services, or who is kind of in charge of like making this list. And then they do these inspections to figure out if a group home says, well, we're a group home, but we're not an institution. Being able to set it up, residents have to be able to put posters on their wall if they want, or, decorations, so.
Bethany said being able to have visitors and set your own routine and schedule.
Yes, that's a huge one. Mhm.
Sarah says a large supportive staff would be at an institution.
Yep. So that's a good question of how can you have staff be at not an institution? And there are some innovative ways that people are figuring that out, also considering the huge staff shortage that we have right now. So there's a really innovative program that Jane, her daughter just started, and she shared a little bit with your her introduction, but they have staff available just a couple miles away that are split between multiple houses. And they have like these Echo Show kind of like, TV screens around their home. So they can either video chat with that staff member like on demand at any time, or that person again is within 5 minutes of being able to get to their home if they need it. So it allows that like in-person support to be spread across more people, but without people kind of sitting around waiting for something to happen if something happens. Yeah.
I don't know if autonomy is the best word for it, but people have said like coming and go as you please, but I'm thinking of like living with other roommates and you all have, like 1 point person. If roommate A wants to go to the store, but you don't have to, but you have to go anyways, is that sort of like a limit to what like a home would be?
Yeah, so kind of having your own, not being tied to the other residents in everything you do. Yeah, I forget how they word that, but I think that is a.
Kind of going off with the privacy / going to meals at a certain time, but like if people are coming in and like doing checks or like doing appointments at times you wouldn't necessarily want, like you don't ever get like necessarily alone time or like some of that autonomy, like Lisa said, because you're really on their schedule, and if you don't necessarily know when someone's coming in, like are you ever truly comfortable in your office space?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So these are definitely ways that you can think of. I mean, I think when I at least initially thought about institutions, I thought of like the big old school, large census, lots of people, multiple beds institution. I didn't also, and those actually still exist in Ohio, but I didn't include group homes that can be just as restrictive. And we really saw that during COVID, where group homes were not set up to give people the social distance they needed or have access to the PPE. So we had large infection rates there, but not even the same safeguards that the institutions had to have in terms of reporting. And there are to this day not accurate reports of how many people with disabilities died who were group home residents, because while there's still so many restrictions in those settings, there aren't the same safeguards. So that can be, and speaking of safeguards, these issues are not black and white. So one of the challenges is that when you say things like have visitors as you want, to set up a integrated home that is not deemed an institution, you can't necessarily make rules of like, well, you can't have a same sex you can't have anyone of the opposite gender in the room with the door closed if we're talking about an adult living in their home. So then you can see that it increases the challenge of things like, sexual education and sexual health and making decisions around that. And whereas we've kind of shortcutted a lot of those things by making these very rigorous rules of saying, well, we just will not allow them to be alone together, and then we won't have to deal with any of the other. So it kind of opens up like multiple other cans of worms. And so sometimes the question is, well, then why do we want to open up those cans of worms? And also another question that comes up is, well, that's all fine, well, and good if you're talking about people with certain disabilities. But what if we're talking about people with significant disabilities who need round-the-clock care, who don't communicate verbally, or maybe don't have an effective way to communicate at all right now? What can a life in the community look like for them? And so I think how I would respond to both those questions is that, first of all, we know that institutionalized settings result in worse outcomes across the board for folks. So that in and of itself should be our motivation to try to move away from institutionalization. So those outcomes being health, social, emotional, quality of life down the board. What I also want to add, though, is don't just get one picture of a deinstitutionalized community life in your head. So sometimes we get in our head that like the successful way of living is in an apartment by yourself. When you think like, well, but okay, if you're talking about somebody my age, most people without disabilities aren't living in an apartment by themselves. So why would that be like the goal for, a person with a disability? Maybe they want to live still with their family or with, friends. And so really the deinstitutionalization movement is creating more flexibility, autonomy, centering people with disabilities and their needs, recognizing that sometimes that will be really hard to figure out and work out in terms of if a person does need round the clock care, being in an apartment on their own may not be the best model for that, but neither is being in a nursing home. We know that that is also not the best model, and that's been the default for far too long. So I think I brought up that institutions can fall under lots of different names. So in Ohio, ICFs are a common name, intermediate care facility. Ironically, I live next to an ICF that someone once thought that our house was like a halfway house for the intermediate care facility, which they don't have halfway houses for ICFs, but just because we also have visible disabilities and they do too. But ICFs are concerning to me because they are very rigid in approaches to what residents can and can't do. I know the ICF that is right next door to me is mostly children and adolescents. And so they almost never go into the community, and our school district actually doesn't accept them into our district. Instead, they bus them to an educational center. So when you think about their level of integration, they're not integrated anywhere, not in our community for activities, not in our schools, and not in their homes. And then we also have group homes that, again, I mentioned often fall under the institutional umbrella. And that's like not my judgment, like you're an institution, you're not. I'm more thinking about how Medicaid deems these, determines how they will pay for people to live in them or not. And in effective March 2023, supposedly, and I say supposedly because it's been delayed for over 9 years now, but supposedly a rule will go into effect that if settings aren't integrated, Medicaid will no longer pay for residents to live there. So Jane's going to teach you more about that. It's called the final settings rule, but there's a lot, as you can imagine, there's a lot of hubbub about it. So some places are frantically working to get their rules adjusted so that they can still qualify. So things like saying, okay, residents, now you can have access to the refrigerator whenever you want. If maybe that's the only thing that's holding them back, which is not likely. Yeah, so it's a weird wild, wild west right now. There have been groups of group homes in Ohio that have their executive leadership team has taken trips to Florida to kind of learn ways to circumvent the rules, because Florida is home to many, many gated communities and communities that have figured out how to kind of circumvent the system and have segregated intentional communities. But so we'll see in March what happens. Theoretically, what is supposed to happen is if we, think that everything's gonna fall into place as expected, is that we'll be moving towards a more integrated, publicly supported with our public dollars of Medicaid, living option for people with disabilities. That doesn't mean that private pay options have to close. If you want your loved one to live in an intentional community or farmstead, the idea with this has never been to close those down. It's just been that using Medicaid dollars, which are scarce, towards evidence-based best practices, which are integrated in the community. So I share that because sometimes there's some advocacy tactics that point more towards like that these efforts are trying to shut those down when there's really no effort in that. Although I recognize that, if you're paid with a certain source and then you're not anymore, that the result of that could be shut down. But as I said, they've had more than 9 years to adjust to what's defined as integrated. So we'll see which of those have done that, I think. So, yeah. So as I mentioned, without exception, almost without exception, have better outcomes when moved out of institutions. But it's very, very difficult to get out of institutions once people are in them. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
So-
So fun.
Would that mean that if that goes through in 2023, I don't even know if this is on,
Yeah, it looks like it.
a place like Ken Anderson Alliance, that Medicaid would be, they could bill Medicaid for living at Ken Anderson Alliance when that is finally built? Is that-
If Ken Anderson Alliance, it is not seen as a segregated community.
Okay.
Which I think is the big question mark of, will they, I'm not sure about their details of their plans with that. So, are people familiar with Ken Anderson? Do you want to?
Does anybody else know a lot more about it than I do? I took a brief tour. Johnny, did you also? Okay.
Everybody's like, not.
They're opening up in Springfield Township, I guess near North College Hill, and sometime in the next 4 years. And it's going to be a community of people with disabilities who need varying levels of care. So they're trying to figure out how many people they can have at each level of care, and then their staffing and types of living arrangements they would need. So there's going to be some apartments, some condos, and some, variation of that. So I mean, I'm personally excited about it. I would love for my son to be living in a community at some point like that, where there's staffing and support, also places to have recreation, like a big community center, shopping, and places to work. They're doing some kind of farm work somewhere. I forget exactly what they're growing, sorry. But that's working out really well, and they're trying to expand it into the community, and coffee shops as well. So.
Yeah, Kevin Potts, the director, sits on our CAC, which is our USED's Community Advisory Committee. So, but I haven't heard that detailed of an update, so that's helpful. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it comes down to, they would have an inspection by Medicaid, not only like a physical space inspection, but also like their rules and policies. And places that are kind of on the line, so this would be classified as an intentional community, meaning that it's going to be built primarily for people with disabilities to live there, not kind of a mixed community. But I don't think that it's going to be a gated community, from what I've heard.
I'm not sure.
I don't know. But so some of the problems that have arisen with the gated communities in Florida have been that they initially planned to be integrated, but there are challenges to be integrated. And so the gated community in itself becomes very isolating. And if you do have, issues of staff abuse and things like that, which happen, not that they should happen, but I'm saying the reality of them happening, that the residents are even more isolated from community and people that could help them, because they're segregated, they're separate. So I don't know, but I know that Kevin, thinks deeply about these things. And so I have no doubt that they're planning to meet, I would guess they're planning to meet criteria to be waiver funded, because that would open up so many more people to be able to have that as an option. And I think, we're in a gray area too. We can't necessarily jump from A to Z. So we may need to try out these different models and see what works. That's a model. The lad house that I mentioned is a model. So there's many different models that are kind of emerging. The farmstead option is a model. Some of the criticisms of the farmstead have been that the people themselves may not have had a lot of self-direction or choice in working there. And so, and not all people who have autism want to work on a farm, or all people who have OI want to wake, and feed the sheep or whatever. So there's aspects to living on a farm which are very unique that may or may not be that person's, cup of tea. So I think those are the things that we have to figure out. And what I also worry about is if we say, okay, well, these aren't Medicaid funded anymore, so they're private pay. I also recognize that makes them only available to some people. So it's a tricky next several years that we will traverse, but I'm also excited to see these different models emerge and to hopefully see advocates push this settings rule to actual implementation. And then we'll see how well it pans out in terms of the ultimate goal to get more people living in the community and integrated.
Quick question.
Yes.
When you were talking about certain places maybe becoming private pay, now should that be something that I guess as family members or anything, should we be kind of concerned? Because now if it's private pay, are we still holding them to a higher criteria, just like Medicare and Medicaid? How they do sanctions if things are unsafe, or if people are not getting the correct care. So is that something that will be a concern maybe?
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you would lose the Medicaid oversight. I think there's some pretty awful conditions in institutions that are sanctioned by Medicaid.
Okay.
So I'm not sure I would see that as the high bar that I think you would want, but it does bring up a really interesting point that if you do move to kind of this, well, we're just going to pay for this on our own model, then who's going to be the one citing and inspecting and fining, or however we motivate people to keep things. You would still have, I think of like Disability Rights Ohio has been called in on a number of cases where conditions have been found to be terrible in Ohio at institutions. And in some cases, they've gone so far as to close down that setting. So I think of, Disability Rights Ohio would still come after you if you were a private institution and, you were abusing people with disabilities and they knew about it. Yeah, that's an interesting point. Thanks. Let's go. Yes, thank you. In my head. So institutionalization has been decided by our courts in the Olmstead Supreme Court decision of 1999 living in an institution is a violation of a person's civil rights. So you often hear the Olmstead decision cited as the reason that our public dollars and our public policy efforts are put towards this right to live in their communities. Now, there's debate about who is responsible for kind of paying for this right. Is it individuals? Is it cities? And there's been all kinds of creative tactics to try to figure this out. So, for example, one advocate was a wheelchair user and she needed an accessible apartment. And the accessible apartments that were in affordable housing in her city had an 8-year waiting list. So she actually filed a lawsuit that this was a violation of her rights under the Olmstead decision because she did not have equitable access to affordable housing because of her disability. So her case did not have a decision like that set precedent and changed the world. Instead, they found her a spot on the waiting list miraculously. But the question still hangs there for me in terms of, okay, our federal system, our Supreme Court decided that it's a civil right to live in the community, but we don't really have any foundation under that to make that happen. So, and that's across the board. Like we don't have a perfect housing system or a perfect transportation system to say that once you are in this house in your community, how are you going to get, to work and to the store and so we have this civil right, but we're still working on putting up the supports to make it a reality for a lot of people. Let's go to the next. So this is one of many powerful, sad images of Willowbrook. Willowbrook was this huge state institution in Pennsylvania that was kind of marketed as a school. And so there was a lot of pressure put on parents who would have a child born with a disability. And really it was all sorts of disability, physical, intellectual, psychiatric, across the board, to place their child in this school where they would get schooling to be, the best person they could be. The children were housed in really poor conditions, group housing. There weren't enough basic resources like clothes and food and supports to feed people who needed assistance. So it, quickly, or maybe from the start, I'm not sure, became a really terrible situation, terrible enough that people knew not to show this to the public. So there was also, the hiding, which also resulted in, horrific abuse and also murders or deaths by not treating many people with disabilities. So there are still, skeletons found around the school of deaths that were never matched to bodies. So it's a really awful, crime that our society committed against countless people that most of us haven't even heard about. But the lingering issue of institutionalization still hangs on today in that, a term in advocacy that we say sometimes is, well, is it a shiny institution? Willowbrook stands out to us because it offended like all of your senses. Like this is actually one of the few pictures where residents are wearing clothes. Many of the photos that came out of this place, it's just very graphic. And so, but today's institutions may be a little bit shinier, but if we still have the same outcomes and the same horrific abuse and dehumanization of people, just kind of warehousing of people, the question is, are we really that much further away from Willowbrook? I think on the next slide, yeah. Mhm.
I'm sorry, just real quick, because you were talking about, I was looking at that picture and you were, saying some things. So also, I'm just wondering, even though that we are now, are we still finding that some institutionals are still kind of over medicating our patients just because they don't really want to kind of deal with them? I know that there was a
You muted yourself.
my phone went out. It was a place somewhere where they were over medicating the patients just because they really didn't want to have to kind of deal with them.
Yeah, there still are reports of that. I don't know, how often it happens. It's one of those things that shouldn't happen. So people, try to not have it happen, but I have no doubt that it still happens. Yeah.
There's even still facilities that use like electric shock therapy. One of my patients was supposed to go there and we were like, absolutely not. We have to find somewhere else, but it still happens because in Massachusetts it's legal. So there's a lot of things even state by state that are very different that you think wouldn't. I was shocked. I was like, that's not real. And then I looked, I'm like, oh no, it's still happening.
Yeah.
To people and kids.
Yeah, there's still sterilization of people, even though, we thought we were not gonna do that anymore, but that still happens. Judge Kavanaugh, actually, interestingly, if you remember his Supreme Court hearings things, a colleague of mine added, they had those multiple days. He was the Supreme Court justice that was confirmed. They had those multiple days where witnesses came to like talk about his past, whatever. And it really got kind of overshadowed by the one incident in his past where he was, accused of sexual assault. But a colleague of mine spoke about one of his rulings where so there were 4 women who lived at a group home or who lived in like a franchise of group homes. So it's like multiple group homes that are owned by the same company, which is actually quite common and quite profitable. The nursing home industry is huge in Ohio, very full of money. But so 4 women had filed a suit because they had been forced to have abortions against their will. Kavanaugh ruled that they, in essence, didn't have a will, that because they were not a will, like if you die, like a will, like a self-determination not to terminate their own pregnancy. So he actually ruled that because they were not under their own guardianship, that they didn't have any decision-making freedoms over the future of their pregnancies, which a lot of people found really interesting since he typically describes himself as, again, obviously against Roe. So based on his current or his most recent vote to overturn Roe. So you can see where disability sometimes becomes kind of the asterisk on people's values and belief. And in that case, I don't know what's in Judge Kavanaugh's heart or his personal beliefs. I'm strictly going off his court, ruling. So one he made very differently than another. Yes.
I just want to make a brief point about the shock therapy. And it is still used. I just looked it up on Mayo Clinic's website because I actually have a friend who has treatment-resistant depression. And ECT is still used sometimes. So is TMS and ketamine treatment, but maybe you're talking about.
It's different, like behaviorally, not as a treatment for, because we use that with some of our patients who have catatonia or something like that. This is like you let your hands,
Yeah, like
you're getting,
punitive.
like someone else shocks them because they're like as a behavioral,
Yeah. That's
not as a like a medical.
Yeah. And then the Judge Rottenberg
Yep.
Center is outside of DC, I think, where primarily kids with autism are sent sometimes, and they have backpacks that are electroshock devices. And it's behavioral.
That's the
Yeah.
place I was talking about.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's what in Massachusetts, illegal there.
Yeah, my patient was supposed to go there and we were like, no.
Yeah,
did
that
not go
place
there.
is
Thank goodness. but,
terrifying. People
um,
have very scary stories
Yeah,
of
it's
surviving. And it's very odd public policy wise because the FDA has actually banned those devices, but they're not willing to take the next step, which would be to actually like implement or hold them accountable for using banned devices. So, yeah. So this timeline I think is interesting too, in terms of like how slow our wheels move sometimes, even when we like should be on red alert, so Willowbrook opened in 1947. Very quickly, it exceeded its capacity. So you can see that it had full capacity in 1955 at 4,000, but by 1957, it had 6,200. So you had this huge problem there. You had many outbreaks. There's also awful history of people testing certain communicable diseases on the people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, believing things like they don't feel pain. And so things that, are also reflected in a lot of the, journals that were able to recover from the Holocaust and Nazis' treatment and experimentation on people with disabilities. So this was, in our backyard. In 1972, Geraldo's big moment, if you're familiar with him, he had this investigative TV report where it's a little like cheesy because he's like literally outside Willowbrook, but he goes in and it's really this like landmark moment in TV history of uncovering disability rights violations because he, really brought it to people's living rooms about the horrendous conditions that people were living in. So there was public outcry, but you can see from 1972 to 1987, Willowbrook still stood open in some form. So it took a really long time to finally close those doors. And the school that we just mentioned, that Judge Rottenberg, is similar. I mean, there's been outcry about this for years, and it just feels like it's taking so long. I feel like that's going to be 20 years from now, we're going to look back and be like, what? The FDA banned it and it still stayed open for years. So Yeah, so the Willowbrook timeline, I think, has some lessons in public policy and pressure too there. I can't remember, I think we're nearing the end. This is just a teaser slide of what Jane is going to teach you more about, these individual policies that have pushed us towards deinstitutionalization, but also, inclusion in the community. So Section 504 being the first in 1973. So that's your Judy Heumann, your drunk history video. The ADA, we've talked a little bit about, that's more like the Capitol crawl, where people with disabilities literally crawled up the Capitol steps to get enough attention to really move policymakers. And then 1999, as I mentioned, that was the Olmstead decision. And then hopefully 2023, March of 2023, we'll have the HCBS, which is Home and Community-Based Services, or they also call it the CMS final rule because it'll be enforced by CMS, which is Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services. I intentionally wanted to talk about like outcomes and quality of life and lots of things before money, but I also wanted to bring up money because it's a reality of our healthcare system and our, societal public policy decisions, and just to bring up how much more astronomically expensive facility care is, nursing home care is, compared to even having home health aides provide care for somebody, and then compared to adult day health care, which is where an adult with a disability would go somewhere during the day to get their care. Many times they live with family members who provide the care during the night and weekends, kind of off the system. But during the day, they have these adult day centers. So the orange box in this also just shows how out of reach both home health care and facility living are for most people with a median income. So just this mismatch in long-term services and supports. And this is somewhat unique to our United States approach with this. In many other countries, Japan, and some European countries, they aren't just kind of responsible for long-term services and supports completely on an individual basis. Their country systems recognize that many of us are going to age into a place where we need long-term services and supports. And so it's a little bit more built into the collective society versus like figure it out on your own if you need it. So, but a major takeaway that I want from you is I think sometimes we can think that like, okay, well, if you're living in a nursing home of 100, 200 people, that's got to be cheaper than, and it's not at all. It's astronomically more expensive to live in a facility. This report, which when I figure out how to get you the actual slides, you'll have links, but this report is if you wanted to go, as I know you all want your nightly reading on congregate settings and the impact of COVID. I conducted a follow-up report to this for the National Council on Disability, where we proposed strategies of like, okay, we've seen sadly the toll that congregate settings took during COVID for people with disabilities, but what do we do now? So what are our next steps? And then I believe we're to our end. So what questions do you have about anything I've talked about so far, or comments or takeaways? Or
Real quick, when you were talking about the young ladies that were forced to have an abortion, I'm just trying to figure out with people that might have intellectual disabilities. There was an episode on SUV where there was a young lady that had Down syndrome and she was being abused by her boss at the store, and she ended up becoming pregnant. She wanted to keep her kid, but the mother was like, no, she didn't think that should, happen. I'm trying to find out, as far as, I guess, when you start talking about intimacy, is there a certain, like they have age of consent, like 16, I think in Ohio, you can consent. So in that aspect, is there a way that they kind of gauge that, or is that just up in the air? I'm just wondering.
Yeah, that's a super interesting question in a pretty well known, at least in disability rights world, which my husband often reminds me is not actually well known here, but to you it is. But there was a pretty well known case so this guy who's anonymous, so we'll call him Bob, he got involved with his professor, Stubblefield was her name, and you can actually look up that case, it's under her name. So he was in what he viewed as a consenting relationship, but he didn't communicate verbally. He uses a communication board, a facilitative communication board. So there was, his family disagreed with the relationship. His family said his professor is taking advantage of him. This is wrong. So his family brought charges of sexual abuse against the professor. So it went to court. Her name's Anna Stubblefield. And the judge deemed that he did not have capacity to consent to any sexual relationship. So yeah, that happens, basically what I guess is my answer to the question. A lot of people were very upset with that ruling because in essence, the judge determined that anybody that would engage with this individual would be abusing him. And this individual was communicating that he wanted to engage in an adult, mutually consensual relationship. So, whether the court was right or wrong is, I guess our individual perspectives, but that's what, in this case, a court actually did determine that this person doesn't have capacity to consent to sex with anyone, so.
And what was the criteria for that? What did they solely just go off because this person had a disability, or was there something that they were specifically looking at?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think my personal view on it is that our justice system has a long way to go to learn about and to consider disability. I look at this individual and recognize that he was in a graduate level course. And when you look at the communications between he and his, partner, they were talking in depth about different literary, samples. And when I say talking, they weren't verbally talking. They were going back and forth with his communication device. So I see plenty of indicators that this person was clearly communicating that they understood the risks of their engagement with this person sexually and that they were consenting to that. I think where in that case the waters got muddied is there was obviously a power difference in that she's a professor and he was her student. So ethically, depending on your school and your, I guess, personal beliefs, there's a problem there, maybe, I don't know. But that's the conundrum that a lot of people with disabilities get in. If you're thinking of your example about, the young woman with Down syndrome, society is often going to look at her as in a powered down position and assume that anyone who would engage with her must be taking advantage of her, which is a very, it's like assuming that no one could actually be authentically attracted to her and consensually engage in a sexual relationship, which, is a problem. Yeah, thanks for bringing up that question because it definitely related and it brings up how muddy our waters are with figuring this stuff out. Because we can think about it one way, but how does it play out in the real world is also what I want you to think about because that's what will come on your doorstep. I think that was a great question to end us on. If we have any other ones. Yeah. All right. Well, I love hearing from you all after lectures like this. So if, as you're kind of mulling through it, you have any questions or you think of an example or something, feel free to shoot it my way. And so thank you all so much. I think do you have SCBM today? You do? Okay. Is it as large group though?